They told her she would never stand on her own 2 feet again, and the whole town of Redbud Crossing waited to see how long a man's love could carry a weight like that. What they did not know was that Silas Hart had already begun tearing out the doorways of his own house, one board at a time, before the doctor had even finished speaking. Adeline Hart was 34 years old, the winter the wagon went over on the Miller Road. It was a plain accident, the kind that happened to plain people on bad ice. The axle caught, the horses spooked, and the world turned sideways in the space of a breath. When they carried her into the house, her right leg lay wrong beneath her skirts, and she did not cry out. She only looked up at the low pine rafters her husband had raised with his own hands 11 years before, and she thought, very quietly, that she might never see the top of them from standing height again. Dr. Pruitt came out from town through snow to the horse's knees. He was 61, a careful man who had set more bones than he cared to count, and he was honest to a fault because he believed a lie in a sick room was the cruelest thing a doctor could offer. He worked over her a long while by lamplight. Then he washed his hands in the basin, and he took Silas out to the cold front room where the girl could not hear. "The hip is turned," he said. "The bone below it is broken in a bad place. It will knit, Silas. But it will knit crooked, and it will knit slow, and I will not stand here and promise you a thing I cannot give. She may take a few steps someday, with a stick and a strong arm to lean on. She will not walk right again, not the way she did. You should hear that from me tonight, so you do not spend the next year waiting for a morning that isn't coming." Silas Hart was 38. He was not a man who said much, and he did not say much then. He looked at the doctor for a long moment, and then he looked past him at the door of the bedroom where his wife lay, and something in his weathered face settled, not into grief, though the grief was there, but into a kind of decision. He thanked the doctor. He paid him in dried apples and a jar of honey, because that was what he had. And when Pruitt's wagon was gone into the dark, Silas stood alone in his own front room and began, in his mind, to take the house apart. Here is a thing you learn about a house when someone in it can no longer climb. Every home is built for people who can climb. The step up from the yard, the narrow hall a wide chair cannot pass, the high shelf, the deep cupboard, the bed set at a proud height off the cold floor. A house is 1,000 small assumptions about a body, and when the body changes, the house becomes 1,000 small cruelties. Silas understood this before the sun came up, and he understood that his wife, who had been strong her whole life, would rather he never speak of it out loud. So he did not speak of it, he simply began. The chair came first. He built it in the barn over 3 long nights, while Adeline slept, and their daughter Junie, who was 6 and full of questions, held the lantern and did not ask them for once. He took the good oak he'd been saving for a wedding chest they would never need now, and he made it into a chair with wheels, great smooth wheels off a light cart, sanded and greased so they would not catch. He carved the arms wide enough for a woman's book and a woman's cup of tea to sit beside her. He padded the seat with wool from their own sheep. When it was done, he did not present it like a triumph. He rolled it quietly into the bedroom one gray morning and set it beside the bed and said only, "For when you're tired of the same 4 walls." Adeline looked at it a long time. Then she looked at her husband's hands, which were cut and splintered from the work, and she understood what those 3 nights had cost him, and she did not say thank you, because thank you was too small. She only reached out and took his ruined hand in both of hers, and held it against her cheek. That was the whole of it. But a marriage can say more in silence than most folks manage in a lifetime of talking. What would he build next? And how far would one man go to give his wife back a house she could live in? He went far. He went as far as a man can go. He tore out the step at the front door and laid a long, gentle ramp of smoothed planks down to the yard so she could roll out into the sun without being carried like a sack of meal. He widened every doorway in the house, taking a saw to the frames he had once been so proud of squaring true, cutting into his own good work without a second's hesitation. He lowered the shelves in the kitchen, every one of them, until a woman sitting down could reach the flour and the coffee and the good blue plates that had been her mother's. He built her a work table at the exact height of the arms of her chair, and along its edge he carved a shallow lip so nothing would roll off before she caught it. The neighbors talked, of course. Neighbors always talk. And the loudest of them was Ophelia Vance, who lived on the next section over and who had opinions about everything from the price of thread to the state of a man's soul. Ophelia was 57, a widow twice over, and she had decided long ago that suffering was best borne quietly and alone, the way she bore hers. She thought Silas was making a spectacle. She said as much at the Mercantile, where the words could travel. "That man is building a shrine to a cripple," she said, "when he ought to be finding a girl to keep his house and mind his child. He'll ruin himself. He'll ruin that little girl too, raising her in a house of sorrow." The words got back to Silas, the way words do. He did not go to town to answer them. He did not raise his voice or his fist. He simply kept building. But something in him grew quieter that week, and Adeline saw it, and she guessed the cause, and it grieved her more than her own broken hip ever had, that her husband's kindness should earn him scorn. It was Junie who softened it, in the end, though she never knew she'd done a thing. That spring the fever came through Redbud Crossing, the low, creeping kind that empties a house of its strength. It took Ophelia Vance and laid her flat in her bed on her lonely section, with no one to fetch her water. She was too proud to send for help and too weak to send at all. She lay there 2 days, and on the third she made her peace, in the private way of the very stubborn, and decided she would simply not wake up again, and that the world would go on without her, and never notice she was gone. She was wrong about the world noticing. Adeline Hart could not walk. But Adeline Hart could see the Vance chimney from her low kitchen window, and on the third morning, she saw that no smoke rose from it, and she knew what no smoke meant in a cold house in fever season. She called Silas in from the field. She could not go herself, but she made him go, and she made him take Junie, and she made him take the broth she had spent the morning cooking from the arms of her chair. They found Ophelia gray and still, and barely breathing. Silas carried her out, and for 11 days the woman who had called Adeline a cripple and a shrine lay in the Harts' own front room, in the good bed, while a woman who could not stand nursed her back from the edge of the grave. Adeline could not fetch and carry. So she directed, and Junie ran, and Silas lifted, and between the three of them they held Ophelia Vance to the living world by main force and mutton broth and a warmth she had not felt since her second husband died. Ophelia woke, on the 4th day, to the sound of a woman singing low in a kitchen. She lay a while listening, too weak to speak, and she watched through the widened doorway, the doorway Silas had cut with his own saw, as Adeline moved about that low kitchen in her rolling chair, reaching every shelf, working every task, humming to her little girl, whole in every way that mattered, and lacking only the one thing the town had decided was everything. And Ophelia Vance, who had borne her own sorrows alone and hard and bitter for 30 years, began at last, silently, in a stranger's bed, to weep, not for herself, for all the help she had refused across all those years, because no one had ever thought to build a door wide enough to bring it through. She did not become a different woman overnight. People rarely do, outside of stories, and this is not that kind of story. But when she was strong enough to sit up, The first thing Ophelia Vance said to Adeline Hart was, "I was wrong about your husband." And the second thing she said was, "Teach me to make that broth." And the two of them, the proud widow and the woman who would never walk right again, became something neither had expected to find so late. Friends, the real and lasting kind, the kind that outlast every hard word ever spoken. Ophelia went home eventually, but she came back every Thursday for the rest of her days, and she brought her thread and her opinions, and she sat at the low table Silas had built, and she never once called anyone a cripple again. She took to bringing small things she thought a seated woman might want, and could not easily fetch for herself: a basket of eggs set within reach, a length of ribbon, a cutting from her own rosebush that she planted along the smooth garden track, so Adeline could touch the blooms in passing. She never announced these kindnesses. She had spent 30 years refusing help and had no idea how to offer it out loud, so she simply left the things where they'd be found, the way a proud person loves when they have forgotten every other way. When she finally passed, years on, it was in her sleep on a soft summer night with the window open, and Adeline was the one who sat with her at the end, holding her hand, and it was as gentle a going as a hard old woman ever earned. But that was later. There is more to tell of the house first, because the house was never finished. That was the secret of it. Silas never stopped building. He built a rail along the porch so she could pull herself up to standing on the good days and look out over the fields with the wind on her face at the height she used to know. He built the rail low enough that it did not tire her arms, and long enough that she could move the whole length of the porch hand over hand, and on the mornings when the pain was quiet, she would stand there a long while, chin lifted, watching the light come up over the fields, exactly as she had watched it as a young bride. He built a special seat into the wagon, low and braced, with a strap so she would never fear the ice again, so she could ride to town beside him with her chin up and dare anyone to look sideways at her. And when she rode into Redbud Crossing that first spring in her braced wagon seat, the same town that had waited to pity her found they had nothing to pity, only a well-dressed woman with a straight back and a husband beside her, nodding to them each in turn as though she had never lain broken on a bad road at all. What kind of man tears out his own good work, year after year, and calls it nothing? The kind, perhaps, who understood a thing most of us take a lifetime to learn. He built, one patient year at a time, an entire world that fit her. A house where nothing was too high, and no door too narrow, and no task beyond the long, strong reach of a seated woman's arms. And a strange thing happened, the kind of thing the doctor never could have promised, because it lived beyond the reach of medicine. Adeline Hart was happy. Not in spite of the chair, not bravely, through gritted teeth, the way the pitying townsfolk imagined she must be. She was happy in a plain, deep, ordinary way, happy in a home that had been made, board by board, entirely out of one man's refusal to see her as less. Every widened door was a sentence in a love letter 11 years long. Every lowered shelf said the same thing the doctor had refused to say: "You are not going to lose your life, you are only going to live it differently, and I will change the whole world before I let it treat you as anything smaller than you are." Dr. Pruitt came out to see her, once, a full 3 years after the accident. He was older then, and slower, and he had thought about the Harts more than he thought about most of his cases, because he had carried the memory of that hard night, and the promise he'd refused to make. He found Adeline in the yard, in the sun, moving between the vegetable rows in her chair on a track of smooth board Silas had laid down the whole length of the garden so she could tend her own beans. She was laughing at something Junie had said. She was 37 now, and her hair had a little gray in it, and she looked, the doctor thought, like the most contented woman he had ever laid eyes on. He stood at the gate a while before she saw him, and when she did, she called out to him, bright and unbothered, "You were right, doctor. I never did walk right again. She patted the arm of the oak chair her husband had made. Turns out, I didn't need to. Pruitt had been a physician 40 years. He had told the truth in 1,000 sick rooms and watched it break 1,000 hearts because he believed the truth was a kindness, even when it wounded. But standing at that gate, looking at that garden and that woman and that impossible, patient, hand-built house, he understood something he had somehow missed in all those years of bones and lamplight. He had told Silas Hart the truth about the leg. He had been dead wrong about the life. A body could be broken, and a life could still be whole, if there was one person in the world stubborn enough to build the world around it. He did not stay long, but before he climbed back into his wagon, he shook Silas's hand, that scarred, splintered, remade hand, and he said, quiet, so the women wouldn't hear, "I've told a lot of folks the hard truth over the years. Figured it was the manly thing, the honest thing. You did more with a saw and a stubborn head than I ever did with all my honesty. I'll remember it." And he did. He was gentler after that. In his sick rooms, he learned, late, to leave a little room in his truth-telling for the things a determined man might build. Silas Hart lived to be an old man. He and Adeline grew gray together in that low, wide, gentle house, and Junie grew up and married a good, quiet fellow and brought grandchildren to roll across the smooth board floors, and not one of those children ever thought there was anything strange about a grandmother in a chair, because the house had never once made her strangeness a fact. The house said she belonged, and so she did. When people asked Silas, in his later years, how he'd borne it, the accident, the doctor's verdict, the long labor of remaking everything, he never understood the question. To him there was nothing to bear. He'd been given a wife who could not climb, and he'd had 2 good hands and a barn full of oak, and the arithmetic of it had always been perfectly simple. You did not ask a person to become a house, you made the house become the person. The town doctor said she'd never walk right again. He was right, and it did not matter, and the proof of it stood there in the low yellow evening light for anyone to see. A woman in a hand-carved chair, tending her own beans, in a house her husband had built entirely around her, humming to herself, going nowhere, and home in every way a soul can be. If this story warmed something in you tonight, stay a moment longer with us. There are more like it waiting, and there is always room by this fire for one more.